Freedom House put together a list of principles to protect different rights during the time of COVID-19 or really any health crisis of this scale. The principles are intended to be guidelines for leaders around the world who are dealing with the coronavirus. They look at emergency measures, safeguards for elections, protection of basic rights, defense against excessive surveillance, and protection of free press. It's really important that officials see the health crisis through a human rights lens. That way they can prevent needless rights violations. And these principles are intended to help them do this. So we all know that voting is the cornerstone of democracy, both because it solidifies trust in government and also so that it can be a mechanism for people to hold their leaders accountable if they're abusing power or if the people aren't happy. But elections are very hard to hold fairly when health risks are high and people are scared. So we saw this right there in your state. I think the example of the primary in Wisconsin shows that the United States needs to take really immediate action to protect the integrity of our elections. I think it's really unfortunate that people in Wisconsin were forced to choose between upholding their civic duty and their health, and that led to disenfranchisement of a lot of people. Also, a lot of the political infighting that we saw is something that can be prevented by making plans in advance, kind of working out those problems well in advance, and then going into the election in a much stronger position. And I think, Wisconsin's not unique in this, and we're seeing something very siller happening today in Poland. And pushing ahead with presidential elections that are supposed to happen on May 10th. There are a lot of parallels here. There's been a constitutional court decision that said that the law that made postal voting legal was, that law was unconstitutional, but then the government pushed ahead in any case. Poland doesn't have provisions for safe in-person voting, and it also doesn't have the capacity to handle the postal voting. And meanwhile, the incumbent presidential candidate who's running gets all this free airtime on the public broadcasters. So, again, I think the U.S. needs to learn from these experiences and start now preparing for the November election. There are a number of ways that we can do this. Most states, or all states right now, have the ability to do absentee ballots, but in some states they need to expand the law so that absentee ballots are legal in a health crisis and not just because you can't make it to the polls for some other reason. So some states have started moving in that direction, but there's also a lot of capacity, and given how decentralized our system is, every state is going to have to handle this differently. There's already some states that have entirely remote voting, but most states do not, and they are not prepared for the volume of mail that will happen around this, for the volume of counting of paper ballots. There's a higher risk with paper ballots, with absentee ballots, that people might fill them out wrong because it's a different system. I think we also need to make voting just easier in all ways. So we need to extend voting hours, have voting be able to take place on more days. There needs to be advanced voting in more states. And, election officials in different states need to coordinate among each other so that they can learn from each other. It's very easy when you're in a heightened campaign situation to do what serves the interests of your party. And we have such a polarized system right now in the United States, and there's so little agreement between the Democrats and the Republicans, and that fosters this kind of territorialism and kind of tribalism that leads people to make accusations against the other side, to say, well, this wasn't fair. I think that was going to be a really high risk anyway in the 2020 election before all of this started. And there's, unfortunately, a much higher risk of that now. most countries have had to invoke some kind of emergency law in order to be able to pass the kinds of extreme health measures that they've needed to put in place. And, that's all understandable. But, from the Freedom House perspective, we think it's really important that these measures be transparent and that they have an end date. And the problem is that we're seeing some countries that are abusing the ability to put emergency laws into place in order to usurp power. The prime example of this is in Hungary, where Prime Minister Orban enacted a very powerful emergency law that has no end date, and it would need to be reviewed by Parliament and the courts, but he, over time in the past, has already consolidated his power and stacked the judiciary in his favor and has a supermajority in the parliament. So the chance that there would be any check on his power is very small. And that kind of high-risk situation is especially, we're very vulnerable to that in a time of so much fear and so much leeway that populations are giving to their governments to just do whatever it takes. And that's why you need to have a system that has, kind of multiple voices in it, right? It needs to have oversight. So, if, say, the governor of New York puts an emergency law in place, then there should be oversight from the state legislature. There should also be health experts who are involved and who are helping to say, okay, we need these measures, we don't need those measures. And the governments should be listening to those health experts, because ultimately they're the ones who know whether something is necessary and proportionate to what's happening. Some restrictions are necessary and others are excessive, and it's important, again, that experts weigh in. What's happening here is very frustrating for us all, and it's very, I live in New York, and it's been very, very difficult. But, to put it in a global context, what's happening here is relatively minor. In Nigeria, the police and the military have been brought in to help enforce quarantines, and more than 15 people have actually been killed by the police and military as they used excessive force to try to keep people indoors. And another kind of extreme example is in Uganda, where the government raided a shelter that had been set up for LGBT people who are generally persecuted in Uganda, and they raided that shelter and they took everybody inside into custody, saying that they were violating freedom of rules on restrictions on assembly. But meanwhile, those people actually lived there, so it would be as if you went into an apartment building and arrested everybody for being under the same roof. So, I think cases like this highlight the fact that that governments are really going beyond the necessary provisions and using the pandemic as an excuse. So while we, face these challenges here at home, we do need to keep it within perspective. Surveillance is one of these things that feels very abstract, and I think it's very easy for people to say, yes, do whatever it takes. I have nothing to hide, so it's fine. But there's a really high risk in this kind of situation of violations of privacy, and I think people don't always realize the way that their information could get used. It's really important that when data is collected, say if you have an app on your phone and you say, I tested positive, so now I can be tracked as I move around in society, or who I came into contact with before I got tested. That information in some cases is collected by the government and used, I'm not saying here in the US, but it has been used in other countries for keeping databases of citizens that then can be referred to later on if suddenly the government has doubts about somebody, or if they are if there's a change of regime and suddenly the people in power have a very different view of things, if that data is saved, they can go back and use it. Also, there are commercial interests that want this data, many commercial interests, and it's really important that that our individual movements and interactions with people don't get abused for commercial purposes if we don't want them to be. So these surveillance technologies should be anonymizing data so that you can't trace it to me. They should be the data should not be stored in a centralized place. It should be stored on my phone and should be wiped after a certain amount of time. And there should be firewalls between the public health purposes of the data and commercial or other governmental uses. What I would say I'm observing in the United States right now, or say 6 months ago before all this started, is a very gradual increase in very subtle forms of surveillance that people are accepting because that small thing doesn't seem that bad, but they're starting to add up into a culture that means that massive amounts of data on us are being collected and we don't really know where they're going. And there's parts of Asia, in Taiwan, in South Korea, people are very, very, they have a huge amount of trust in their government and they feel like nothing can happen to this if this can't go wrong. But governments change, interests change, and if you don't know where that data is, and you don't have access, you don't have the ability to find out what data there is on you, it can definitely be abused. I think that the threat to press freedom is really acute, and a lot of the problem is that it poses a health risk, right? If the information can't be publicized, if accurate information can't be put out there, then people don't know the right steps to take. And we probably all remember that feeling, well, it's still going on, but especially at the beginning where you were like, I don't know what to believe. I don't know what this virus is. I don't know how it spreads. I don't know what the symptoms are. That huge amount of all of the unknowns, which of course are still going on, are just heightened in an environment where the government says, well, if you don't publish what I say you can publish, then I'm going to arrest you. And that's exactly what's happening. It just happened to a journalist from the newspaper The Guardian in Egypt. She had her press credentials revoked and she had to leave the country because she reported different estimates of the spread of coronavirus in Egypt than the ones that the government was putting out. And I think also, the case of China, a couple months ago, we were hearing a lot about Dr. Lee, and we were learning a lot about the ways that China had suppressed information, and a lot of that has subsided recently, and we hear less about that. And I think we hear more about how China has successfully combated COVID-19 and the way it's brought it under control. And one thing to remember is that China is, it's a highly repressive regime that controls the media message very tightly, both at home and increasingly in other countries. And China has launched a very systematic propaganda campaign to make itself look like the victor in all of this, and as kind of proof that the Chinese system is superior to democracy. And look at those Americans and how they're just messing this up one day after another, and look at us in China, we've combated this virus. And it's important to be really to think really critically anytime you hear information about China, and think, can I trust this information? Is this the whole story, or am I only hearing one little piece of it? An example that I was thinking about recently was the BBC was reporting on people crossing on the border between China and Russia, and they were moving from, the Chinese government was unhappy because the border was open, and they were saying China had combated COVID-19, and now these people from Russia where it's not being brought under control, they're crossing over the border and they're bringing it back into China. And that's probably true. That's not false information. It's being reported by the BBC, and I trust them. But is that the whole story of COVID-19 in China, or are we just not hearing about the cases that are still being found in that country and how they're being dealt with? I mentioned New Zealand, South Korea, Germany. I think New Zealand is a really interesting case. They have an election scheduled for September. They've not yet postponed that election. And instead, they are making a lot of moves towards how they can prepare. They're not saying, well, by September, this is all going to be over. So they're thinking about what they can do to prepare for that election. They're looking into things like, can people phone in their ballots? I don't know that I am in favor of that, but they are, that's an interesting idea. They're looking at different means of mail-in voting, whether there can be people come and pick up ballots and assist people, and then also how can you keep the polls safe so that the people who do want to go to a polling place and feel comfortable doing that, how will they feel safe? So it is possible for a government to take steps and to prepare and to not be in denial and to not engage in infighting and to protect their democracy at the same time. People are innovative, right? I mean, my experience at Freedom House is that the more repressive a country gets, the more creative the people get. We've been seeing that in Venezuela, say, where they have this basically total collapse of their economy and a government that went from being repressive to just being an all-out totalitarian dictator, but not totalitarian in the sense that they have total control, because it's sort of chaos in much of the country, and that has bred this enormous innovation. And I think we're already seeing that a little bit now. People starting to figure out, say, even the restaurateurs figuring out how they can do delivery when they used to make all of their money from people eating in their restaurant. You see that on the political front as well, right? And I think that at the end of this, democracy is probably going to look different, but democracy is a very adaptable system. That's why it has been successful for so many years, and that's why we at Freedom House continue to think that it applies to every country, that it's not a Western system, that it's not something that that only fits a rich country or a certain demographic, and it's why people demand it all over the world. And so I do think that democracy is going to adapt, and the way that we vote will look different, and the way that we protest will look different, and the way that we organize will look different, but it'll still be democracy. And I really am quite hopeful in that regard. The best thing is, of course, what our audience is all doing, which is keeping themselves informed, knowing what's going on, and again, thinking critically about what you hear and making your own judgments. But you can't do that effectively if you don't have a solid understanding to begin with. But also, continuing to speak up when you see abuses, whether they're at the local level right in front of you or whether they're national. Speak out on social media, talk to your friends. It's really important in the environment that we're in the United States now for people to sort of talk across the aisle, right? There's such a movement in this country right now to say, I don't have the patience to talk to people from the other side. I just can't even listen to them. And I think we all need to think about how toxic that is for our democracy, because if the majority takes the position that because they won the election, they can do whatever they want, that is infringing on the rights of a very significant percentage of the country. So we do really need to think past the partisan differences that we're all caught in right now and try to bridge the gaps and to move forward together. I think that the best possible outcome is that our democracy gets strengthened by this, that we learn to set aside partisan differences in certain areas for a greater goal of what's best for the country, that we expand provisions for voting to make it more flexible so that more people have the opportunity to vote both during a health crisis and in general. I mean, we should always be skeptical of anyone who wants to restrict voting in any way. The news industry has been suffering for a long time, and it's been very unclear what was going to happen to local newspapers, and there's many people who there's no information about their local government because there are no journalists anymore. And I hope that the importance of having local information will be highlighted through this crisis, and that will make people be creative about how to reinstate some of those local institutions that can help them. I guess I would say that, as someone who is outside of it and watching the weeks and especially the days leading up to the Wisconsin primary, it looked like this was going to be such a disaster. And, I guess in some ways it was, but it was so encouraging also to be here on the outside and to hear the stories of voting day and how people were queuing up and how long they were willing to wait, and that that people really did believe in making this happen. And I think that it's super encouraging, and I hope that Wisconsin won't be thought of as a kind of a negative example to be avoided, but also a positive example to be emulated. And I think you should all feel good about being part of that.